It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large with Warner Lewis. 60 minutes of smart talk radio with interesting guests from all walks of life begins right now. So sit back and enjoy. And now, from the flight deck, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radios once again in your future. This segment's certainly no exception. Got a good one. I'm going to be talking to Win Smith Jr. Who is Win Smith Jr.? Here's who he is in a nutshell, and we'll find out even more over the next 25 minutes or so. He was born in New York City, received his BA in political science from Amherst and his MBA in finance from Wharton University. Long career with Merrill Lynch, beginning in the bullpen, held staff positions there in a variety of different departments. During his final decade there, he was the EVP of Merrill Lynch and Company, a member of the Executive Management Committee there, chairman of Merrill Lynch International, and later he headed up for one of four business units with 9,000 employees, $2 billion in revenue, and client assets, as you can imagine, of $180 billion plus. He has recently penned a work called Catching Lightning in a Bottle, How Merrill Lynch Revolutionized the Financial World. Merrill Lynch Company for decades with an extraordinary reputation and a style and culture of doing business. And with that is kind of a rough and tumble introduction. Win, how are you, my friend?
I'm great, Warner. Thanks very much. Pleasure being with you today.
Well, we're very excited to have you here. Merrill Lynch, if there's such a thing as a financial brand name, it's Merrill Lynch. If you would, share with our listeners a little bit. Let's get started here. Tell us about the origins of the company, go all the way back to 1914. But in particular, we're concerned about the year, I believe, 1939, about a decade after, or right after the end of the Depression. Tell us about the very beginnings of the firm.
Sure. Thank you, Warner. It all began on that day on January 6th, and there was a young visionary by the name of Charlie Merrill. He'd worked at a couple Wall Street firms and then decided he really wanted to set out on his own, so he started, was essentially a two-person shop, he and his secretary, and a year later his old roommate from the YMCA joined him, and that became the first Merrill Lynch and Company in 1915. And my own dad, right out of Amherst College, joined as a runner, and that began a 40-year friendship and partnership with Charlie Merrill. And in the early days, Merrill was a securities firm, a bond house, but they were known mostly for underwriting the issues of chain stores. The big first deal they did was for McCrory's store. And in 1929, Merrill got very concerned about the bubble in the market and the over-leverage that was going on, and he talked to his partners and his clients to basically get out of debt before the crash of 29, and it really saved all of their hides. But then he wasn't very optimistic about the market, so he sold the securities business to E.A. Pierce in Chicago, and he stayed involved with basically merchant banking. He bought Safeway stores and really revolutionized the grocery business, too. But then in 1939, Pierce was a partnership, and my dad, who was then a partner at Pierce, was very concerned that nobody would want to re-up and put their capital back into the firm because it was a pretty bleak period of time. So he approached Charlie Merrill. He said, there's an opportunity here. What we see is a different way of doing business. And in those days, Warner, it's really kind of unique. It sort of looks a lot like today. The average American didn't trust Wall Street. They didn't understand how to invest. They felt that only the fat cats, as they were called in those days, the 1%, had an opportunity to make money, and therefore they really weren't participants in the market. So my dad convinced Merrill to come back in, and they came up with a strategy of bringing Wall Street to Main Street. And they did a very few fundamental changes in the paradigm of the business. First of all, they took their brokers off of commission. So they took away that conflict of interest, and they paid them a salary and a bonus. Secondly, they actually trained their brokers. They sent them to a school for up to a year to learn about the business before they set them loose on society. Thirdly, they separated research from, any investment banking department or institutional department, so it really was independent and could give good, solid, independent advice. And then fourthly, they spent a tremendous amount of time educating the public. Instead of having bragging advertisements, they did advertising that educated people about how to invest. They had vans that drove around the country and basically gave seminars in small towns. And it was really a unique strategy that proved out to be very effective. And effectively what it did is it democratized the capital markets, brought Wall Street to Main Street, and thereby brought Main Street to Wall Street.
You know, I think a very telling quote about the culture at Merrill Lynch was Arthur Levitt, the former chair of the SEC under President Clinton, referring to Merrill Lynch as the only firm on Wall Street with a soul. Why? I'm curious as to the business model. There was one of connecting, one of a lot of transparency, tremendous communication, as you've referred to earlier. Why in the world did it take so long, so to speak, for that to happen on Wall Street? It almost feels like an indictment of Wall Street in the early years.
You know, it was. And, Wall Street in those days really catered to the very rich. They catered to the corporation. They didn't think that the average American was worth catering to. And, that really opened up a marvelous opportunity for Merrill, my father, and their partners to step into that void. And, as the war ended in the 1940s, and, America began to recover and the middle class was built, the middle class had money to invest. And that was a tremendous opportunity for Merrill Lynch that others didn't see at the time.
So they really felt like, wow, we can jump into this space, so to speak, and become a well-known brand, even with middle America.
They did. And, they were philanthropists. They obviously were good business people that saw an opportunity that others weren't looking at.
I'm curious as to movies like Wall Street and The Wolf of Wall Street. When you see those, hear about those, do those make you wince, or do those make you recognize and say, yep, they're nailing it right on the head?
You know what, the problem with those movies are, that stuff did exist. Now, I haven't seen The Wolf of Wall Street, but I understand, and people have told me what it's about. That probably did happen in the bucket shop. It didn't happen in the Merrill Lynch or, a Dean Witter or Morgan Stanley. But, there were scoundrels like that there. 99% of the people that work for banks and Wall Street are good, honest, honorable people, but they're scoundrels. And a lot of scoundrels took over some of these firms, and in my opinion, caused many of the problems that, have reverberated across the entire economy after 2007 and 8.
The culture there, again, as we've talked, and again, if you just joined us, we're talking to Win Smith, Jr., son of one of the founders of Merrill Lynch, and the work that is brand new called Catching Lightning in a Bottle, How Merrill Lynch Revolutionized the Financial World. One of the extraordinary things was, again, that Merrill Lynch did have a conscience, that it did connect, and that people felt like, wow, I'm not being talked down to here. I'm being treated as a real life customer. I'm curious as to the relationship between your father and others that were principals there. Did they know of one another from other businesses and so therefore knew about their business acumen, or how did they all come together and have this common vision of customer service?
Well, it really did start with Charlie Merrill. Charlie Merrill started writing about the average investor and the customer's interest having to come first before he even started his own firm. In fact, in 1911, he wrote a really convincing article in a paper called Leslie's Weekly, which was about the customer interest and how the average investor, had to be treated. And that was just a core principle with him. And, he passed it on to my father. My father passed it on to his successors, and therefore down the line to the people in my days. And that was just, an embedded value that we lived by. And, the test of character is always in difficult times, not in good times. And so we were tested many times as a firm. We made mistakes. We had a bad apple. But the question is how do you react to those situations? And did you ultimately do what was right for the client? And I list many examples in my book about how Merrill actually did that.
You were with the firm almost 30 years. It was, I'm sure, a labor of love. You watched all kinds of things change, from maybe not only the people inside the firm, but the technology and the ways in which you communicated and did all of that. I'm curious, over that 28-year period, I know over that 28-year period, were there fundamental shifts in any major philosophical tenets at Merrill Lynch?
No, there really were not. We changed, we evolved. We went from being only a U.S. brokerage company to, in the final days before I left, to being a global private wealth asset management institutional investment banking firm. But the CEO who came after Bill Schreier, a fellow named Dan Tully, he really saw an important thing. He saw as we were growing, we were expanding, we were acquiring other firms, that there had to be this codification of the principles. So he listed them, in 5 simple principles. The client's interest has to come first. You have to have respect for the individual, your people. You have to have teamwork. You have to be members of your community, and you had to practice integrity at all times. And he had those principles hung on every wall in every office around the world, and even in the local language. And that was his way of saying, we're growing, we're expanding, but we have to have one set of values and principles, and that is what's going to differentiate us from everybody else.
Tell us, and again, I know you worked in all kinds of different departments there, but probably HR not your specialty. I'm curious, during the interview process and the recruiting process, competency is one, education's another, drive is another. How high on that list, and how did you judge character of those brokers and those staff people coming in?
I think very high. In fact, we had a process that was unique on Wall Street in selecting managers, especially in our branch managers on the retail side of the business. We had an assessment center, and the assessors were existing managers, and when a prospective person came through that, there was basically a default. There was always a question, is there anything about this person that lacks integrity? And if anybody even questioned that, that person was rejected no matter how good his technical skills were.
What about, and again, your resignation was certainly well documented, but in 2001, you finally had gotten to a point where you were just not prepared to carry on with the new direction the firm was taking under the new CEO, E. Stanley O'Neill. Can you share with us, to the extent that you're comfortable, what some of those differences were and how that played out?
Oh, sure. It was actually, I tell people I enjoyed every day of my 28-year career except for that final day. And I had actually walked into a meeting with Stan with every intent of staying. He changed my job from being chairman of Merrill Lynch International and offered me to be vice chairman of the firm responsible for our most senior relationships around the world. But, I sat down in the conversation and I asked him what he thought about the principles. And, he disparaged them. He made fun and mockery of what Mother Merrill was. And literally halfway through a sentence, I stood up and I said, Stan, I'm sorry, I can't accept the job, and I'll retire, and best of luck, and I walked out. And I knew at that time that it was going to be a different firm, and I thought it was going to be marginalized, and I couldn't be part of it. But I really never thought it could be brought down the way it was.
So this was done without any real consultation with the family or anybody else? This was just, in essence, you had seen enough?
I had. Obviously my family was extraordinarily successful, and I wasn't sure, going into the meeting whether I was going to stay or not. But the night before I had said, I think I will give it a year. One of my colleagues had said, stay, I'm going to give it a year, and at the end of the year, if we don't like it, we can leave. And my wife at the time and my family said, we're 100% behind you, whatever you do. But I don't think they ever expected me to walk out and actually leave.
Right. Well, and again, ultimately, Merrill Lynch is purchased by the Bank of America, in essence, to save it from collapse in 2008. I'm curious as to when you heard that news, and you probably saw it coming, but when you saw that the thing was finalized, I'm curious as to your feelings that day.
Oh, tremendous sadness and remorse. I will say I thought John Thain did everything he could, and I think at the end of the day, having Bank of America buy Merrill for $50 billion at the time, was the best move he could have made. So it was bittersweet. We hated to see it go, but we also knew that the alternative was worse. Merrill would have gone the way of Lehman at the end of the weekend.
It seems obvious, but I'm curious as to this book. There's a lot of detail here. This is not a light read. I'm curious as to the motivation here, how much of it was a labor of love. There's a lot of information here you had to research. You weren't pulling it all from memory. I'm curious as to why and how much of a labor of love was it, or did it turn into quite a project once you got it going?
It was a labor of love, Warner, and it was a project. And I had a great partner in writing the book, Bill Eckenbarger, who was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and so he helped me a lot with the research. And Bank of America gave us access to all the archives, which was very nice of them. But, I wrote it for a couple of reasons. It certainly helps me bring closure to a sad chapter in my own life. But I wanted to make sure that, the true history of Merrill was told, and people didn't just remember the O'Neill era or the collapse of 2007. I wanted them to to really recognize what a great firm it was and, how important it was not only to Wall Street, but to the entire economies. And then I also wrote it for all the Merrill Lynch families who really felt that Merrill was a family. And they were so proud of being there, and they were so saddened by what happened, and in many ways financially shocked, financially ruined in some cases. So the reaction I'm getting from the book, from the Merrill people, is thank you for bringing back the memories. We just loved our time there, and we really enjoy reminiscing about it again.
Let's look at today's world, what the relationship between Wall Street and the American government, and I'm not talking about regulation, but right now, what is that relationship, and is it in a good spot, or what needs to be fixed if it's not?
Well, I think it's in a terrible spot, Warner, and just like 1939, the average American doesn't trust Wall Street, and that's rolling over to the legislators and the regulators as well. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, 99% of the people working in these firms are great, honest, decent people who are doing a good job for their clients. But the leaders of Wall Street, they need to understand they've got an image problem, and they have to spend a lot more time on humility and less hubris. They've got to get focused on values instead of vanity. They've got to understand that some of these compensation packages, just rub the raw nerves of people. And they have to understand that Wall Street has to relate to Main Street because it is so important to our economy. And if they don't, I fear that the pendulum is going to swing far the other way, and we can have a far less efficient capital markets in this country.
Yeah, I agree with you for sure on that. I'm curious, though, as to, along those same lines, my sense is that the average American still doesn't think the playing field is level, and they still have an inherent distrust of Wall Street. And I'm curious as to your opinion, and you may have already said the answer, but what is Wall Street doing to get over that? And what are they acting better than, are we behaving better than we were doing in a pre-2008 world?
I think we are, but Wall Street it's a broad mantle. So
Yes,
Wall Street is trading, it's hedge funds, it's investment banking as well as the private wealth side of the business. I actually think the private wealth side of the business gets it. And if I look at how Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenton & Smith under Bank of America is operating today, I think it's great. I think they get it. I think they value the principles. I think that the Morgan Stanley Private Wealth Group gets it. UBS gets it. So that segment of Wall Street, I do think, gets it, and they are doing fundamentally the right things. But when you look at the Wolf of Wall Street, that unfortunately brings out the worst. When you look at some of the trading operations and the whale at J.P. Morgan, it just reinforces this image of gunslingers on Wall Street doing silly things that have no value for the economy. And that's what I think the leaders of Wall Street have to understand is they've got to get back to focusing on clients, talking about clients, not talking about counterparties, and not being arrogant and not listening and not trying to bully the regulation through. They've got to be good, normal, humble people that reach out to the average American.
And again, because Merrill Lynch was such a bellwether when it came to customer service and just the word service, I'm curious as to, from where you sit, look across the American business landscape, any companies in particular that which you're particularly impressed?
In the financial sector, you mean?
No, actually beyond Wall Street. Let's go beyond Wall Street. Look around at any customer or any companies rather you think that really have it nailed just right.
Well, I think there are lots of companies. It's hard to pick out one, but companies are going to be successful if they're doing the fundamentals right of serving their client right. So right now I'm still a client of Merrill Lynch. I'm very pleased with the service I'm getting there. So I think there are lots and lots of companies that do it well. I'm selling my book through Amazon. That's very interesting. Yeah. But then I go down into Main Street America, and I deal with local shops and local organizations. And there's some spectacular businesses. I think we have to remember that in the United States, the biggest employers are not the bigger employers. They're the small businesses. And there are always going to be small businesses coming up and doing well. And, the Merrill Lynch of 100 years ago, there's that firm out there somewhere today.
Well, the work is a fascinating one. The title is called Catching Lightning in a Bottle, How Merrill Lynch Revolutionized the Financial World, by Winthrop H. Smith, Jr., the son of one of the founders of Merrill Lynch. What an extraordinary company. tremendous example of how good things can be. Probably pretty obvious again, Win, but how can people get a copy of the book? And are you out doing any kind of in-person book tour, or tell us about that?
Sure. It's available right now on Amazon.com. I've actually been approached by, a publisher to, maybe circulate it more broadly, and it's being sold locally where I live now in Vermont. But Amazon.com is the best way of getting it. And yes, I've actually, I do run a full-time resort in my second career, so I can't be on the road too much. But, I've been asked this week to actually go out to 3 of Merrill Lynch offices that are celebrating the 100th year and be part of their reception. And that's very pleasing to me because, I was persona non grata for a few years there, and I'm being welcomed back home in a sense. So that's what I'm doing this week. You
mentioned you're the president of the Sugarbush Resort in Vermont. I'm curious, are you instilling some of that same culture there?
Absolutely. I just took the basic principles of Merrill Lynch, and we use them at Sugarbush. The guest interest has to come first. We're all about fostering teamwork. My people, if I don't respect them and they don't feel part of an organization, they're never going to deliver good customer service. We're part of a small community, and I'm in many ways the big fish in that small community, so we really try to contribute to the community in many ways, philanthropically as well as other ways. And then integrity is everything. I'll give you a good example on a snow report. If it's raining, you better say it's raining or people aren't going to believe you when it's snowing.
That's right. I haven't heard that analogy before, but it is a good one indeed. Hey, Win, thank you so much for joining us and again sharing, I think, a story that maybe certain people in the financial world may know about, but most do not, and that is the culture and the entire approach to business that Merrill Lynch took. And again, the work is lightning in a bottle. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful 2014.
Thank you, Warner, and you as well.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.